Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming along this evening or this afternoon. It's getting chilly outside, but it's good to see so many faces here. So this evening, I'm going to speak to you about some various aspects of the history of Grampians, or Gariwerd, which are, just for your reference, in case we don't know, right here. So we're over here. Now, we're talking here about the transition between the Western District and the Wimmera above, and the Grampians sit right on that. And I'm going to go into why that's important in this talk as well. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about those two names, Grampians and Gariwerd, and where those names come from and some of the controversies around those names as well. Now, it's a very large topic, the history of Grampians or Gariwerd, and to fit everything into the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to have to begin. So, I'm not a geologist, so I'm going to do my best here. I'm a historian. But to give you a bit of a potted geological history of the Gariwerd Mountains, they sit above a layer of bedrock, which is about 500 million years old. And sometime around 400 million years ago, sediments, so things like sand, were washed away into an ancient valley or a trough, which filled that valley up. And over time, tectonic forces hardened those sediments. They deformed them and they finally tilted them on an angle, which can be seen all through the mountains. Those rocks became what's become known as the Grampians group, geologically speaking. About 195 million years ago, those rocks were still mostly underground. And then about 65 million years ago, so technically this is still history, so I'm still within my ambit here. 65 million years ago, the seas started to erode the landscape around the Grampians group, leaving only those quartz-heavy sandstones. Some of molten masses pushed up into those rocks of the Grampians group and exposed what some of you may be familiar with, the low rounded hills in Victoria Valley. About 58 million years ago, the sea invaded the Murray Basin north of Gariwerd, which formed the sediments and the landscape that would become today's Wimmera Plains. And then again, 14 million years ago, the coastline of that sea extended to the feet of Gariwerd, which were really part of a southern promontory extending into the sea, and Mount Arapiles was an island off the coast. Volcanic activity about 2 million years ago, extending up to as recently as 5,000 years ago, formed hundreds of volcanoes and eruption points across what would become known as the Newer Volcanics province, surrounding Gariwerd to its south. This disrupted various drainage patterns and altered the landscape. The volcanic activity left in the south rolling fertile landscapes of the Western District, while the receding oceans in the north left behind a dry or semi-arid landscape of the Wimmera, which some of you may be familiar with. Around 70,000 years ago, the seas dropped to a level that exposed a series of islands between Southeast Asia and Northwest Australia. And by the time the first Australians arrived in the Grampians region, which was well over 20,000 years ago, its form had taken the shape that we see today. Since the last ice age, Gariwerd and its surroundings have undergone significant environmental changes. The climate was drier about 20,000 years ago, and temperatures and rainfall gradually increased. And from about 10,500 years ago, the region became wetter, and there's evidence of lakes, for example, beginning to overflow and fill up. There was a period of instability in the climate, but from a period just before the arrival of the Europeans in the region, in the middle of the 19th century, the local climate became much more settled. It was a wetter climate than we have now, and it was somewhat fateful that the Europeans would first explore the region in a period of relatively high rainfall and moisture, and therefore lush and alluring vegetation and a very promising looking landscape. Now, because of this geology and because of this history of climate, the flora and the fauna of Gariwerd are diverse. They're influenced by those geological features, and which in turn create various different soils and various different habitats. Gariwerd is home to over 975 native plant species, many of which are endemic to the region. The park, which is now the Grampians National Park, is home to nearly 170 species of threatened flora and fauna. There are species there that exist only in the Grampians and in Tasmania, which are left over from when the Bass Strait had not been flooded yet. The area is home to at least 230 species of birds, 40 mammal species, 30 reptile species, 11 amphibian species, and 6 native fish species. There are also various introduced species, which I'll get to in a moment. So it's an important botanical reserve, Australia-wide and worldwide as well. It's undergone millions and millions of years of transformation. And the first Australians who lived in this area observed many of those changes, especially over the last 20,000 years. So, to come to this name Gariwerd, which I've mentioned a couple of times, and you'll notice that I sort of flip between the two, Grampians and Gariwerd. At the time of the arrival of the Europeans in the middle of the 19th century, the Grampians had a number of indigenous names, one of which was Gariwerd, which was the name of the mountains in what we can describe as the Western Kulin nation of the Yawajali and the Djabwurrung people who lived in the area, and they shared about 90% of their vocabulary, including this word for the mountains, Gariwerd. That word was first written down in some form in 1841. It was taken from a Yawajali speaker by the Chief Protector, George Augustus Robinson, and I'll mention him a couple of times. He took it down, spelt this way, as more like Gariwerd. And from speakers of the Djabwurrung language to the east, Robinson recorded Eriwer, which he described as the country of the Grampians, which to me sounds like a mishearing of Gariwerd. There are different variations of Gariwerd as well. Kawa, Gawa, and Gar. That last word, Gar, being a generic word for the mountain peak or a pointed mountain. In the south, on the southwest coast of Victoria, among Gunditj Mara speakers, the mountains were called Marai Bugam, while Wadawurrung people called the mountains Tolit Mutgo. So there were various different names for these mountains. In 1878, a prolific author on the subject of Aboriginal Australians, Robert Smith, claimed that the dense vegetation of the Gariwerd Mountains meant that Indigenous people could not have lived there, or they could not have lived there year-round at least. It was simply too hard to imagine, he thought. Archaeological research since that time, since 1878, has since shown that humans have been occupying the area for at least 22,000 years, and the evidence suggests that more people moved into the area over time. Now, 22,000 years is really just the archaeological evidence to hand, and the likelihood is it could be double that period. So the overall outline of the story is something like this. Humans were occupying Gariwerd from at least 22,000 years ago, and the record indicates that more and more people begin living in the area after about 5,000 years ago. From about 2,000 or 1,500 years ago, usage of the mountains and other parts of southwest Victoria was at its most intense. And the history of Gariwerd's occupation over the last 20 millennia has been driven by a range of social, demographic and environmental influences. People in From that evidence from 22,000 years ago, we're looking at the last ice age, when people likely sought refuge in and around the mountains due to the more reliable water sources. And during that last ice age, the occupied territory of Australia generally shrunk up to 80%. So people began living around those well-watered mountain areas. Gariwerd was at the western extremity of one of those environmental refuges here. So we're looking here at about round here. Beyond here was an arid landscape that was difficult to live in during the Ice Age. From about 10,000 years ago, when occupation of the mountains continued, the archaeological record shows Gariwerd being occupied in a more localised and more intensive way. After about 5,000 years ago, when tree cover had eventually expanded over the mountains and water was even more abundant around the ranges, the artefacts in rock shelters around the mountains begin to be dominated by more local materials used for more domestic purposes, for cooking, for example. There was more focus on the local region, and there was a more intense domestic focus of the activities as well. It's argued by some researchers that the flooding of the Bass Strait about 11,000 years ago pushed refugees north, which might account for some of the growing population in southeast Australia after this time, and it might explain some of the intensified use of the Grampians mountain ranges. Increased population densities might have eventually contributed to more intense localised occupation of the land, and the settling climate that I mentioned also helped. There was an increase in the use of rock shelters around the Grampians mountains, and the way they were used changed. There was this growing population density across Western Victoria, and with that, there were new environmental strategies emerged, including the use of fire and new aquaculture and plant harvesting techniques. This was key to sustainably using the environmental resources. Archaeological evidence also shows that trading networks expanded, which allowed resources to be transferred over much longer distances. There becomes evidence of both ceremonial and domestic use of sites around the Grampians Gariwerd from around this time, including campsites and small villages in the mountains and on the surrounding plains. For example, the Wartook Basin, pictured here, once a large, shallow swamp, was home to a small village where kangaroo meat and roots were roasted on embers, and findings suggest that Wartook may have been the focus of seasonal ritual and hunting activity involving groups of many hundreds or even thousands of people from across the region. I mentioned some of those rock shelters, and this is one of the benefits of the hardened sandstone of the Grampians, and these protected shelters also protect a range of artwork, some of which is very, very old. In these rock shelters, food was prepared and meals were cooked, and various ceremonies took place as well. The Indigenous people who lived in the Grampians and their ancestors left behind evidence of their society and their culture in the form of this rock art. In 1859, for example, one pastoralist, Samuel Carter, discovered a large rock shelter on Yowajali country, which was covered in approximately 2,500 different motifs, including vertical bars, human figures, human hands and feet, emus and dots. His station was near modern-day Balmoral. Yep, so talking about the Billamina rock shelter. So Carter suggested, this was just his interpretation, that people had been counting time by moons and would draw strokes on the rock representing the number of moons that had been there. And this site, which was Billamina, was the subject of the first published recording of a rock art site in Victoria in 1897. More recent archaeological studies of the rock shelter floor show that the shelter was used for both rituals and for ceremonies and for more domestic purposes over time. We also have the Munya rock art site, which is located about 2 kilometres from the Wilhelmina site, and this is on the western side of the Grampians. This was reported by Europeans in 1929. It was the second major rock art site discovered by Europeans in Victoria. It consists of 2 large open shelters with nearly 300 paintings, mostly in red pigment, featuring many hand stencils, animal tracks and human figures. It had been used for at least 10,000 years, up to around 2,000 years ago, and for the more recent past, it was used for more domestic purposes. And another rock art site, now there are hundreds of them and these are only a couple of examples. The final one I'll discuss is Bunjil's Cave. In 1896, a journalist in Stawell published a history of the town. It mentioned a significant rock art site in the Black Range to the east of the main Grampians Mountains. That journalist said that some people believed there was a mysterious cavern in the area which contained what he described as primitive drawings by ancient peoples. But he also said there was little foundation for that tradition because no one had found it. Another writer in 1904 claimed that there was a figure of Bunjil and his dog, which were painted in a small cave in the Black Range near Stawell, although he hadn't seen it himself. This was in the 1920s. By the 1950s, the site of Bunjil's Cave, or Bunjil's Shelter, was discovered by Europeans, and the painting was found to show Bunjil with 2 dogs, not just one, as the descriptions had it. This caused some doubt to the painting's authenticity. Some people believed it might have been created by Europeans. One resident in Stawell said that Bunjil had been drawn in the early 1950s by a young girl, and another story suggests that a local eccentric had painted the figure after seeing a statue of Buddha, and we are here talking about this one. There was an increasingly dominant view that Bunjil's Shelter was the work of settlers, and it became widely accepted to the extent that the site was struck off the Victorian Archaeological Survey in 1980. It was restored a couple of years later when analysis of the paint used finally confirmed that both Bunjil and his 2 dogs had in fact been painted with traditional Aboriginal ochres that were many years old. The parts of the painting had been traced over with European whitewash and red lead paint, which explained some of the confusion. There was also graffiti on the site from around 1911. Two young men had gone and written their names below the picture. Now, beyond these 3 examples, somewhere around 90% of Victoria's rock art is located in Gariwerd. There are hundreds of sites, but only some of them are open to the public, and many more have been discovered in recent years as a kind of ironic result of the bushfires which have cleared away vegetation and opened up access to new sites. Although people have been living, as I've said, around Gariwerd for at least 22,000 years, the languages that came to be spoken there that the Europeans encountered by the middle of the 19th century were related to languages that had emerged across Australia about 5,000 years ago. They were based on a single root language from the Gulf of Carpentaria, which expanded southwards across the Australian continent. The expansion of this family of languages also coincided with the development of new technologies, ecological practices, and social institutions across the continent. And there's quite a lot of debate about what exactly happened 5,000 years ago. In any case, when the Europeans arrived in Western Victoria in the 1830s and the 1840s, they encountered not only Djapurong and Yawajali speakers, but also their complex social and cultural organisation as well as their biocultural and ecological knowledge and practices. The colonists' efforts to understand the organisation and makeup of the Indigenous peoples of the Port Phillip district of New South Wales, as it was then known, emerged around 1839 with the creation of the Port Phillip Protectorate under Chief Protector George Augustus Robinson, who I mentioned before. The Port Phillip district was divided up into 4 sectors, and assistant directors were assigned to each. Assistant protectors, I should say. They were instructed to learn the local languages and undertake a census of the Aboriginal populations. What they encountered was a clearly defined social organisation, and they came to believe that the district could be divided up into language areas, and that each language area was divided into smaller groups based on family or perhaps something else, they weren't entirely sure. One of the assistants in Western Victoria and the Grampians area wrote in 1854 that he thought, and I quote, "Each of these tribes has its own district of country, its district boundaries being well known to the neighbouring tribes. The subdivision of the territory even went further than that. Each family had its own locality. To this day, the older men can clearly point out the land which their fathers left them and which they once called their own." So I show here a map of the estimated or rough territory of Djab Wurrung speakers and Yawajali speakers to the west. And a more detailed map would show some of these smaller groups which were once referred to as clans, but some anthropologists now prefer the term local estate groups, which were more locally defined around, for example, different features such as Mount William or around rivers. So there were smaller groups as well as these larger language groups. And in turn, Yawajali and Djab Wurrung speakers, along with not Gunditj Mara actually, along with Wadawurrung speakers, were part of the larger Kulin nations, which shared certain features of the language. The colonists at the time likened the social structure of Western Victoria to that of the Scottish Highlands. In 1841, for example, George Augustus Robinson, he wrote in his journal that the Aboriginal clans or tribes are like the Scotch clans. Another Scottish squatter, Colin Campbell, said that the local people lived in clans and their laws were not dissimilar to those of Scotch Highlanders a century and a half ago. Those concepts, things like clans and tribes and some of the descriptions here, often collapse the different layers of Aboriginal culture and society into one easily definable unit, such as a language group. And at this point, I want to emphasise that it's not my place here tonight to profess expertise or to teach you this evening about Aboriginal cultures and societies in the Gariwerd region. For this, I'm going to have to make the painful suggestion that you might have to go for a weekend holiday to the Grampians and learn from traditional owners themselves. It's as good an excuse as any. And as with understandings of Indigenous society and culture around the middle of the 19th century, much of what we know about Djab Wurrung and Yawajali environmental and land management was often recorded in the works of colonists and in oral traditions. That information about environmental management is therefore also fragmentary and subject to the European interpretation. Generally speaking, however, these recorded materials, recorded in the 19th century, illustrate that Indigenous economies in which natural resources were central operated with the aid of complex social and cultural systems. The exploitation of the natural world required cooperation, collaboration, and exchange. Furthermore, ecological knowledge and processes were embedded within social and cultural practices, so that environmental practices could not be taken apart from those other parts of life. And knowledge of the environment was and remains a key element of Australian Aboriginal life and culture. One colonist in 1881 even said, "It's very questionable if even those European people who belong to what is called the middle class, notwithstanding their advantages of education, know as much of their own laws of natural history and of the language of the heavenly bodies as the Aboriginal people do of their own laws and of natural objects. Again, you really must book that trip to the Grampians to learn more about this side of things. So, about names again. The Grampians. In 1836, going back a couple of years again, the explorer and the then Surveyor General of New South Wales, Sir Thomas Mitchell, named Gariwerd after the Grampian Mountains in his native Scotland, where he was from. He first referred to Gariwerd as the Coast Mountains, and then various different names which were associated with King William. He also called them the Blue Mountains, as did other members of his expedition party. It was only later on in his expedition that he finally settled on the name the Grampians. Now, the source of this name is the Grampian Mountains, which encompass a very, very significant portion of the Scottish Highlands, which you can see there on the map, including its most extreme peaks, as well as the site of the defeat of the indigenous Caledonians by Julius Agricola around 83 AD. This battle was recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus as having occurred at a place called Mons Gaupius. In about 1476, an edition of the biography of Agricola appeared in which Mons Gaupius was incorrectly written as Mons Grampius. Sometime later, in 1520, a Scottish historian labelled that region the Grampians, which was another misspelling of the original. And so, in the middle of the 19th century, Gariwerd, in the southwest of the Australian continent, came to be named after the site of an ancient Roman battle on the far side of the world. So that's a bit of a background to where the Grampians comes from. So it was a quite prescient act that Mitchell would name the mountains so, because within a few short years, the area in and around Gariwerd would become home to a significant number of Scottish colonists. In 1836, one politician claimed that the settlement at Port Phillip will probably be reinforced by a large number of emigrants and a considerable introduction of capital from Scotland. By 1848, around 2/3 of those who held squatting licences in Port Phillip were Scots, and in the Western District, 2/3 of the squatters were from Scotland, and this includes the Grampians area. The pastoral settling of the country around Gariwerd began in around 1838 and was largely complete by 1848. Around half of the pastoral stations that would be established were already claimed by 1845. The pattern of pastoral expansion into Western Victoria was a bit like a scramble for the best land available. To give an example of this from a squatter who would settle closer to Mount Cole, he described how after surveying the barren plains of the Loddon, he and his brother selected the country at the foot of Mount Cole as the best unoccupied tract. At that time, the country was occupied from Geelong to the Trawalla Ranges, but it was quite vacant beyond these to the north and west. We tenanted a large tract of country, as it was the fashion then, for squatters to occupy the best spots as stations without much regard to their distance from each other. The land in and around Gariwerd eventually became a patchwork of pastoral holdings, as you can see here. The mountains themselves run up and down here, and these are the various pastoral stations that covered the mountains. Now, as those early Scottish colonists well knew, the land was not unoccupied before their arrival. Pastoral expansion was a particularly violent process in Western Victoria, and the mountains did not escape. Resistance to the Europeans on Djab Wurrung and Yowajali country emerged in 1838, and violence, which ranged on a continuum from individual murders to larger scale guerrilla-type warfare and planned massacres was at its peak between 1840 and 1842. Resistance had largely been broken by 1845, but a heavy toll had been exacted. On Djab Wurrung country, it's estimated that at least 70% of the population had died from disease, malnutrition, and the conflict. The figure on Yawajali country to the west was probably around 80%, and roughly a quarter of those had been shot by the colonists directly in altercations. The final phase was characterised less by violence and warfare and more by exploitation and dislocation. During the 1850s and 1860s, the survivors could still be found working on and living around stations around Grampians, Gariwerd, and especially in the wake of the gold rush and the related labour shortages on pastoral land. In 1858, after a select committee recommended the formation of a reserve system and the creation of local guardians, the few hundred Djab Wurrung and Yawajali speakers left in the area were provided with food, clothing and other items by pastoralists in the area. Many were found living on the edges of Western Victorian townships and on the gold diggings. In the 1870s, the remaining Djab Wurrung and Yawajali speakers were removed to reserves at Framlingham, at Lake Honda and at Ebenezer. The coming of the Europeans and the large-scale, almost complete removal of its previous occupants led to a disruption of those land management regimes that had been in place for many thousands of years, and that brought about various environmental changes. The Europeans were actually at first delighted and deeply curious about the environments of Gariwerd and their surroundings. Charles Hall of Hall's Gap took great pleasure in the native flora and fauna of the mountains. He wrote that there was a wonderful charm in exploring country thus uninhabited except by the natives and wild birds and animals. He recorded how herds of kangaroos abounded in the forests, emus grazed over the plains, in some cases so tame as to approach the rider with a strange gaze of curiosity. The creeks were then all fringed with reeds and rushes, undevoured by hungry cows. These reeds and rushes formed a beautiful edging to the dark, solemn pools overhung by the water-loving gum trees, where the wild fowl abounded, as the plains did with quail and turkeys. Hall remembered that he had tame emu chickens performing their strange juvenile antics round my reed mia, yellow striped and downy little objects, difficult to be recognised as the sources from which future mature emus were to grow. A female kangaroo was a familiar intimate of my hut, and on excellent terms with the dogs which had murdered its poor mother. Wild ducks, geese and swans were constant visitors upon the waterhole opposite my door, and occasionally a pelican or spoonbill appeared as a rarity. This is quite common in the early accounts from pastoralists, a interest and a curiosity and a delight in the natural world around them. Almost a century after the first European colonists arrived, however, one writer lamented how the settlers had arrived on Djab Wurrung and Yawajali country and had entered their domain, and I quote here, entered their domain with his sheep to pillage that which nature had bequeathed to her servants. He laughed and shot at their uncivilization. He shot their food, he ate their sheep. His sheep ate the glades bare and drove their game to deeper seclusion of the ranges. And this was a gentleman, his name was James Cow, writing to the Horsham Times in 1938. He continued to say that with the white man's sheep came destruction of this verdant growth. Wide areas were cleared to permit the growth of grass. Tracks were cut through the walls of tea tree and heath. Timber was felled and nature held at bay. The whites brought with them the danger of fire, but this menace was being counteracted by the denuding of the valley. Speaking with some of the older settlers of the region, James Cow, the author, argued that from these men of experience, we learn that if the squatters' sheep and cattle are taken from these hills, nature will gladly take the opportunity of restoring the denuded country to its natural state of profusion and wilderness. but will not take into account the carelessness of the white man's fires. The days when stretches of bush were just so much more than land are gone, and we're beginning to wake up to the fact soon there will be very little virgin territory left, he wrote in 1938. He left a fairly poetic lament for the changes that had come with the arrival of the Europeans, and also provides a useful outline of some of the nature of these transformations. The pastoral enterprises had left the land often denuded, he said, and the squatters had hunted local indigenous fauna. Beyond livestock, the Europeans had also introduced a range of other plant and animal species to the region. They'd also interrupted the established fire regime, which in turn had ecological consequences. And more recently, there is much contemporary scientific evidence to support some of these anecdotes, including changes to the fire regime. This is an image from an illustrated newspaper of deer in the Grampians, which are still there today. In 1869, a local resident of the Grampians wrote to the editor of the Australasian newspaper that he thought the country in the vicinity of the Grange, as Hamilton was first named, is admirably adapted for the reception of hares, whilst the Grampian range seems, by the harbour it would be to any of that tribe, almost to force itself on the notice of anyone accustomed to the pursuit of deer at home and acquainted with the habits of that race of animals. In 1868, the Ararat Advertiser told its readers that the deer are breeding amongst the hills, being the hills of the Grampians, there being a great number of young to be seen in the herd. In the rugged places of the hills, which answer as fastness for them, they are safe from pursuit by dogs. It appears the Aborigines will have nothing to do with them. When they first saw the flock, they were greatly frightened. All things considered, Mr. Wilson, a local landowner who brought in deer, seems to have shown much judgment in choosing the Grampians for these animals. It's very likely they will increase much faster than the acclimatisation society supposed. And by 1875, it was reported with some excitement that if the accounts which reach us from time to time concerning the increase of the deer in the Grampians be true, these hills will shortly become a regular resort of the sportsmen. And we are still dealing with these deer to this very day. Besides deer, rabbits were also introduced. We know about them. Additionally, the squatters had also hunted some animal species for food and sport. The brush-tailed rock wallaby, for example, was once abundant in the Grampians, but was hunted for its skin and its fur and for sport. Many of those first arrivals, the pastoralists, hunted the dingoes, which they described as native dogs, which had once been very numerous in the region. One writer in 1857 said that in some of the mountainous parts of Victoria, referring to the Grampians, the dingoes were so very numerous and fierce and hunted in such large packs that the natives were afraid to venture among them and often had to take refuge in trees. Now, there have been more recent calls to reintroduce dingoes to the Grampians, but they've not been met with much of an enthusiastic response. From the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, the mountains attracted more than just the pastoralists. The mountains themselves were, of course, too steep and too rocky for much agricultural and pastoral industry. But local landholders and government authorities soon found a use for the vast water resources that came down from the Grampians onto the surrounding plains, including, eventually, the vast irrigation projects that would service the Wimmera, especially the dry Wimmera to the north. Scientists were attracted to the Grampians for the geological features, but particularly for their flora and fauna. The mountains became a focal point for botany and for plant collecting for scientific institutions across the British world. Soon the growing towns and the industries of Western Victoria became hungry for timber, and the Grampians was, for most of the 20th century, a key forestry ground. From time to time, tobacco plantations and fruit orchards have flourished around the Grampians. Much of those tobacco plantations were replaced with wineries in more recent years. Quite notably, the Grampians were home to one of the last great gold rushes of the 19th century, when gold was discovered right at the turn of the century. Thousands descended on the mountains, particularly around Mount William, pictured here. In the end, only about 700 kilograms of gold were discovered. More fruitfully, sandstone quarries have been operating since the 1860s at Heatherley, particularly in Mount Difficult. What was called Grampians freestone would be quarried for use in the construction of several significant buildings in Melbourne, including the Town Hall and Parliament House. With industry developing, railways and roads eventually reached the Grampians. Road links to and around the mountains were constructed from the 1920s onwards, and tourist services began to appear in the mountains themselves. So from the 1920s and the 1930s, recreation and tourism in the mountains became a popular pastime for Victorians, and the evolution of rail and road travel at this time played no small part. Industry in the mountains continued to develop and change. It was perhaps the scientific interest, combined with its popularity with the public, that were most influential in the eventual declaration as a national park. But this recognition of its natural assets did not occur until much, much later. It wasn't until 1984 that the Grampians National Park was formed. And at that time, it became the largest national park in Victoria. But suggestions that Gariwerd could become a national park had emerged much earlier, more seriously as early as 1908, for instance. And the story of those decades between the early 20th century and the eventual declaration of a national park has much to do with local concerns and debates about conservation and economic utility, as it does with the complicated and fairly messy path Victoria took towards establishing a national park system for itself. The economic value of forestry was one element of this, but so was the fact that the Forestry Service was actually much better resourced and capable of maintaining the Grampians for public access than the National Parks Authority was for many, many years. From its inception, it was underfunded and highly understaffed. Rangers would famously sell timber and grazing licences to pay for their own salaries. Throughout the 1960s and the 1970s, Victoria's national park system expanded, and with it came calls for a Grampians National Park. The number of national parks increased by 1970 to 23. In 1971, the Land Conservation Council recommended the creation of a Grampians National Park. It recommended in particular that 166,000 hectares of area be used to provide opportunities for recreation and education associated with the enjoyment and understanding of natural environments, to conserve and protect natural ecosystems, to supply water and protect catchments, and to protect sites of geological, archaeological, and historical significance. Camping would be allowed outside the water supply regions or the catchments. Horse riding would be permitted too. The existing road network would be maintained and expanded, with a particular emphasis on the roads providing access to popular tourism sites in the mountains. Here we go again about the names. After a short consultation process in the late 80s, the park was renamed the Grampians Gariwerd National Park in 1991. That proved controversial. It was reversed after the election of the Kennett government in 1992. It would later be revealed that government ministers at the time purposefully stoked the controversy to create interest in the park. In 1998, Victoria introduced the Geographic Place Names Act, which allowed for dual naming of geographical features. And that has been subsequently adopted in the park. And here are some of the dual names, being European and Indigenous names. I mentioned in the last slide that from 2017, a coalition of traditional owner groups submitted a native title claim over Gariwerd and the Grampians National Park. Joint management negotiations between traditional owners and Parks Victoria have commenced, and by the middle of 2018, Parks Victoria had developed its cultural heritage management plan for Gariwerd with traditional owners, hinting at the path ahead. So it's been generally understood, well understood by many people for a very long time, that the mountains are geologically and ecologically significant. Gariwerd and its people have witnessed a great many transformations. The people who live there and have lived there, and the ways they used its resources and the impact that this has had on the environment have all changed, and sometimes in ways that are quite drastic. As a result of the first waves of pastoral settlement, the grassy woodlands of the plains below were altered, as were their ecosystems. By the end of the 20th century, it was an appreciation for the environment and its conservation that dominated the ways that people came to think about the Grampians. The last 200 years, or slightly less than 200 years, have been a period of dramatic and concentrated change, but just one part of the last 22,000 years of human occupation and use of Gariwerd. The Aboriginal people of Gariwerd and their ancestors had lived in and around the mountains for thousands of generations. They witnessed and caused their own environmental changes and had their own ways of thinking about the environment. The rediscovery of Australia's ancient past and the recognition of Indigenous Australian belonging to the land and broader awareness of distinct ecological knowledge have become more prominent in recent years. And by coincidence, it was the declaration of the Grampians National Park in 1984 which occurred at the same time as this cultural and political revival. Grampians, in a way, Grampians Gariwerd and its history has become a bit of a microcosm of these debates and the discussions of national significance. Understanding the past, such as this, in my view, can only serve to strengthen our ability to adapt and respond to those environmental changes we face in the future. Thank you for listening.